The three princes of the Valkyrie Dominion stood on the command deck of their flagship and watched the planet below them spin slowly in the darkness of Space Orcs. Was the eldest, and he carried himself with the pride of someone who had never known defeat in his entire life. Kale was the middle brother, and he was known throughout the Empire as a tactical genius who had crushed rebellions on 6 different worlds. Murek was the youngest, and he preferred books to battles, but their father had insisted that all 3 sons must prove themselves worthy of the throne. The Archon, who was their father and ruler of 11 star systems, had given them a simple command: bring me a victory, and the one who brings the greatest triumph shall inherit my throne when I am gone. So the 3 princes had gathered the finest army their civilization had ever produced. 40 warships filled the space around the Sar 7, and within those ships waited 12,000 elite Valkyrie warriors who had trained their entire lives for moments like this. The Valkyrie were a proud species who stood nearly 8 feet tall with scales that shimmered like polished bronze and 4 arms that could tear through metal when needed. They had conquered dozens of worlds, and their empire stretched across 100 light years of space, and now they had come to this forgotten frontier planet because their scouts had reported something interesting. A small force of humans had established a camp in the northern valley. Prince Zorath pulled up the intelligence report on his display screen and let out a sound that was half laugh and half snort of contempt. The report described humans as a relatively new species to the galactic stage. They came from a world called Earth, which was classified as a Category 4 death world due to its dangerous weather patterns and abundance of predatory life forms. The humans themselves were described as soft-skinned and slow-healing, with an average lifespan of only about 80 standard years. They had no natural armor and no claws and no venom. They could not regenerate lost limbs like the Valkyrie could. They could not see in complete darkness. They could not survive in vacuum for even a few minutes by every measure that mattered. They were one of the most fragile sentient species in the known galaxy, and yet somehow they had spread to over 200 worlds in just 3 centuries. Prince Kale studied the tactical display and counted the human signatures in the valley below. 212, he announced with obvious amusement. We have brought 12,000 warriors to face 200 humans. Zorath grinned, and his sharp teeth gleamed in the dim light of the command deck. Then this shall be a quick hunt, and we can return home before the season changes. Only Prince Mirek remained silent as he stared at the data scrolling across his personal screen. He had been reading everything he could find about humans since they had received this mission, and something about that made him uneasy. They had fought 47 wars since becoming a spacefaring species, and they had never lost a prolonged conflict. But Mirek kept this information to himself because his brothers would only mock him for his caution. The fleet moved into position, and dropships began launching toward the planet's surface. Prince Zorath insisted on leading the vanguard personally because he wanted the glory of first contact with the enemy. As they descended through the atmosphere, Zorath addressed his warriors through the ship-wide communication system. Today we hunt the weakest prey the galaxy has ever produced, he declared. These humans are soft and fragile, and they will break before our might like dry branches beneath our feet. The warriors roared their approval and checked their weapons one final time. The dropships landed in the hills overlooking the valley, and the Valkyrie forces began assembling in perfect formation, while 1,000 warriors stretched across the ridgeline, and their armor caught the light of the rising sun and made them look like an ocean of bronze down in the valley. The human camp looked small and vulnerable. Few prefabricated structures surrounded by makeshift barriers. Some vehicles that looked barely capable of handling rough terrain, and somewhere among those structures 200 humans were waking up to their final morning. Prince Zorath raised his command staff and prepared to give the order to attack, but before he could speak, an old voice called out from behind him, "My prince, if I may have a word." Zorath turned and saw veteran Commander Thrall approaching. Thrall was ancient by Velkara's standards, with scars covering most of his scales and one arm that had never fully regenerated after some long-ago battle. He had served the Dominion for over 200 years, and he was the only officer present who had actually faced humans in combat before. "What is it, old one?" Zorath asked with barely concealed impatience. "I wish to request permission to remain with the reserve forces." My Prince Zorath stared at the old warrior with disbelief. "You wish to hide in the rear while your princes lead the charge?" Thrall did not flinch at the accusation. "I wish to survive long enough to report what happens here, my prince." Some of the nearby officers laughed at this, and Zorath waved his hand dismissively. "As you wish, old one, but know that you will miss the greatest hunt of your lifetime." Foil bowed his head and retreated toward the rear lines. As he walked away, Prince Mirek noticed something in the old warrior's eyes that looked almost like pity. Not pity for the humans they were about to attack, pity for the Velkari, who did not know what they were walking into. But Mirek pushed the thought aside, because the horns were sounding and the army was beginning to move. 12,000 Velkari warriors crested the ridge and began their descent into the valley. Sun was fully risen now, and its light made their armor blaze like fire. They moved in perfect formation with their weapons ready and their hearts full of certainty. Below them, 200 humans waited. Prince Zorath smiled as he marched at the head of his army. He was thinking about how he would describe this victory to his father. He was thinking about the throne that would soon be his. He was thinking about how easy this was going to be. He had no way of knowing that in the next 48 hours, he would lose everything he thought he understood about warfare. He had no way of knowing that those 200 humans had already seen his army coming and had spent the entire night preparing a welcome that would haunt Velkari. Nightmares for generations. He had no way of knowing that he was about to learn why the galaxy's most fragile species had never lost a war. The valley waited below them, quiet and still, and somewhere in that quiet, 200 humans finished their preparations and took their positions and waited for the enemy to come to them. One of them lit a cigarette and took a long, slow drag. Another one checked her rifle for the 15th time and found it satisfactory. Their commander, a woman named Sarah Chun, looked up at the approaching army and felt nothing but calm. She had seen worse odds before. They all had. That was simply what it meant to be human. The first wave of Velkari warriors crossed the ridgeline with their weapons raised, and their war cries echoing across the valley. Prince Zorath marched at their head, and his golden armor marked him as royalty among his people. Behind him came 800 of the finest soldiers the Dominion had ever trained, and they moved with the confidence of predators who had never known what it felt like to be prey. The human camp sat quiet and still at the bottom of the valley. No movement could be seen among the prefabricated structures. No sounds of panic or retreat reached the ears of the advancing army. Zorath smiled at this because he assumed the humans were frozen with terror. He assumed they had looked up at the bronze tide descending toward them and simply given up hope. He was wrong. The first explosion ripped through the left flank of his formation and sent bodies flying through the morning air. Before the sound had even finished echoing, a second explosion tore through the right flank, then a third, then a fourth, and then the gunfire started. It came from everywhere at once, and it came with a precision that Zorath had never experienced in any battle before. Every shot seemed to find its target. Every burst of fire cut down another warrior. The humans had spent the entire night turning the valley into a killing ground. They had buried mines and patterns that funneled the enemy into predetermined channels. They had set up overlapping fields of fire that left no safe ground anywhere. They had positioned automated turrets in hidden locations that activated the moment the Velkari crossed certain invisible lines, and they had done all of this with only 200 soldiers. Zorath dove behind a rocky outcrop as bullets tore through the air around him. Something hit his shoulder, and the pain was unlike anything he had ever felt before. He looked down and saw blood pouring from a hole in his armor where a human projectile had punched straight through around him. His warriors were dying. They fell in waves as they tried to advance, and the survivors scrambled for any cover they could find. The war cries had stopped, and now the only sounds were screams and gunfire, and the constant thunder of explosions from his position behind the rocks. Zorath could see one of the human defensive positions, a small bunker made of sandbags and metal plates that held maybe 4 or 5 soldiers. He watched in disbelief as those 4 or 5 humans held back an entire company of Valkyrie warriors. Every time one of his soldiers tried to advance, the humans cut them down. Every time they tried to flank, the humans adjusted their fire and cut them down from a different angle. The humans moved with such casual efficiency that it almost looked boring. To them, 1 hour into the battle, Zorath received a report that made his blood run cold. 800 casualties, my prince. 800 of his warriors were dead or wounded, and they had not even reached the human perimeter. Yet he looked across the valley to where his brothers commanded the other sections of the army. Prince Kael was organizing a flanking maneuver with 2,000 fresh troops. They would swing around to the east and hit the humans from the side, while Zorath kept them pinned down from the front. It was a sound tactic, and under normal circumstances it would have worked. But these were not normal circumstances. Watched through his tactical display as Kael's flanking force moved into position, and then he watched as a single squad of humans repositioned to meet them. 8 soldiers against 2,000. It should have been a joke. It should have been suicide. Instead, it became a nightmare. Those 8 humans held the eastern approach for 40 minutes. They used the terrain like it was an extension of their own bodies. They fell back from position to position in perfect coordination. They made the Valkyrie pay for every meter of ground with blood. When one of them ran out of ammunition, she fixed a blade to the end of her rifle and kept fighting. When another took a wound that should have been fatal, he simply wrapped it with some kind of adhesive bandage and returned to the line. Kael threw 200 warriors at that single squad, and it took him 40 minutes to finally overrun their position. When the Valkyrie finally reached the human foxholes, they found only bodies. 8 bodies surrounded by over 150 dead Valkyrians. Pinned to a rock next to one of the fallen humans was a handwritten note. "You are welcome to this hill. We have plenty more prints." Mirek read the message when it was transmitted to his position, and he felt something he had never felt before. Fear not. Fear of death, because every Valkyrie warrior was prepared to die in battle. Fear of something worse. Fear of an enemy that simply refused to behave the way enemies were supposed to behave. As the sun began to set on the first day of battle, the 3 princes gathered to assess their situation. They had lost 2,400 warriors. Nearly 20% of their entire force was dead or too wounded to fight, and the humans had lost perhaps 40 soldiers. The mathematics of this made no sense to any of them. They had attacked with 60 to 1 odds, and they were losing. Prince Kael suggested a night assault because surely the humans would be exhausted, and their defenses would be weaker in darkness. Prince Zorath agreed because his shoulder was screaming with pain, and he wanted this to be over. Only Prince Mirek hesitated, but his brothers overruled him. As they prepared for the night attack, a communications officer approached with a face that had gone pale beneath his bronze scales. "My princes," he said with a trembling voice, "we have intercepted their transmissions. The humans have been communicating with their command throughout the battle." "And what does their command say?" Zorath demanded. Officer swallowed hard before answering. "The humans have been requesting permission to withdraw for 8 hours. Their command keeps denying the request." Officer paused, and his next words changed everything. "They say reinforcements are still 3 days away, and this position is classified as having minimal strategic importance." Earth stared at the officer as the meaning of those words sank in. Minimal strategic importance. The humans were not defending this valley because it mattered to them. They were defending it simply because they had been ordered to hold it, and they had been requesting retreat. because 200 soldiers against 12,000 was not a fight anyone expected them to win, but their command had said no. They stayed, they fought, they died, and they kept fighting anyway because that was what humans did, Prince. Mirek pulled up the intelligence file on humans again and found a section he had skipped before it. Described something called the human chain of command, and how human soldiers were expected to follow orders even when those orders seemed impossible. It described something called unit cohesion, and how humans would die for each other without hesitation. It described something called fighting spirit, and how humans measured victory not by survival, but by whether they had done their duty. Mirek read these words and finally understood what they were facing. The humans were not fighting to win, they were fighting because fighting was what they did. Winning was simply a bonus. Night fell over the valley, and the Valkyrie prepared their assault somewhere. In the darkness, 200 humans minus their 40 fallen brothers and sisters checked their weapons and prepared to do it all. Again, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun looked up at the stars and wondered if the reinforcements would arrive in time then. She shrugged and pushed the thought aside. It did not matter if they arrived or not. She and her soldiers would hold this valley until they were relieved or until they were dead. Those were the only two options, and for a human, those had always been the only two options. She smiled in the darkness and waited for the enemy to come. The night assault began 3 hours after sunset. Prince Zorath had ordered his warriors to attack under cover of darkness because he believed that no species could fight effectively when they could not see. He was wrong again. The Valkyrie moved through the darkness with confidence because their eyes could see heat signatures and movement even in total blackness. They crept toward the human positions in silence and prepared to overwhelm the defenders. Before they could react, the first wave was within 50 meters of the human perimeter when the night turned into day. Flares shot up from the human positions and bathed the entire valley in harsh white light, and then the gunfire started again. The humans could see perfectly well in the darkness because their eyes glowed with some kind of artificial enhancement that Zorath had never encountered before. They had devices attached to their helmets that let them see heat signatures just like the Valkyrie could, and they had been waiting in silence, knowing exactly when and where the attack would come. Night assault failed within 20 minutes. Azeroth lost another 600 warriors and gained nothing as dawn approached on the second day. The princes gathered again to discuss their options. They had now lost 3,000 soldiers, and the humans still held the valley. Kale suggested aerial bombardment because their gunships could destroy the human positions from above. The gunships launched and swept toward the valley with their weapons. Charged, the humans shot them down with portable anti-air weapons that seemed to appear from nowhere. 3 gunships destroyed in less than a minute. Azeroth ordered his communications officers to jam the human frequencies so they could not coordinate their defense. The humans switched to hand signals and written messages carried by runners. They fought just as effectively without their radios as they had with them. Every tactic the princes tried, the humans had an answer for. Every strategy that should have worked failed against an enemy that simply refused to follow the rules of warfare. Prince Mirek spent the second day watching the humans through long-range sensors, and what he saw disturbed him more than any battle he had ever witnessed. He saw a human soldier with a shattered leg dragging himself to a better firing position. The Poston soldier set up his weapon and continued shooting at Valkyrie targets while his broken bones scraped against each other with every movement. Should have been screaming in agony. Instead, he was laughing and calling out targets to his squadmates. Mirek saw humans sharing food during brief lulls in the fighting. They passed containers back and forth and made jokes that he could not hear but could see. In their body language, they were surrounded by death and outnumbered beyond any reasonable hope of survival, and they were laughing. He saw a human officer walking upright between defensive positions while bullets flew around Hirsch. She moved from bunker to bunker, giving orders and checking on her soldiers, and she did not crouch or run or show any sign of fire. A Valkyrie sniper took aim at her 3 different times. Each time she moved at the last moment, as if she could sense the danger. The 4th time the sniper fired, she did not move. The bullet struck her in the side and she stumbled. Then she stood up again and kept walking. She pressed one hand against the wound to slow the bleeding, and she kept giving orders as if nothing had happened. Marek saw wounded humans refusing to be evacuated from the front lines. They demanded to stay with their squadmate. They said they could still fight. They said they would not leave their brothers and sisters alone. One human had lost his right arm below the elbow when a grenade exploded too close to his position. The medics bandaged the stump and offered to carry him to the rear. He asked for a pistol instead. He spent the rest of the day shooting at Valkyrie with his left hand. Marek accessed the classified xenobiology files on humans that the Dominion had compiled over the decades. What he read made him understand why the old veteran had wanted to stay in the rear. Humans were pursuit predators. Their ancestors had not been the fastest or the strongest creatures on their world. Instead, they had survived by chasing their prey over long distances until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. They could run for hours without stopping. They could track wounded animals for days without rest. They had evolved to simply keep going when every other species would have given up, and this evolutionary trait had shaped everything about their psychology. Humans did not think about battles the way other species did. They did not calculate odds and withdraw when the numbers turned against them. They had a concept called the last stand, where they would fight to the death against impossible odds simply because surrender was not acceptable. They had stories and songs and legends about warriors who had died fighting rather than running away. Their culture celebrated those who refused to quit, even when quitting was the only logical choice. Marek found a quote in the files from a human prisoner who had been captured during a border skirmish decades ago. The human had been asked why his species kept fighting in hopeless situations. His answer had been recorded and classified at the highest level. "You do not seem to understand," he had said. "We do not fight because we think we will win. We fight because that is what we do. Winning is a bonus." Marek read those words over and over and felt the certainty of victory drain out of him. By the end of the 2nd day, the Valkyrie had lost 6,000 warriors. Half of their army was dead or wounded. The humans had lost perhaps 80 soldiers. 120 humans remained to defend the valley against 6,000 Valkyrie. Prince Zorath was barely conscious. His shoulder wound had become infected despite the best efforts of their medics, and he was burning with fever. The stimulants that kept him on his feet were destroying his body from the inside, but he refused to retreat, refused to return home as a failure. He refused to lose to 200 humans. Tomorrow, he announced to his brothers, tomorrow, we commit everything. Every soldier we have left will attack at once. We will overwhelm them with numbers. We will crush them beneath our feet. We will win this battle, or we will die trying. Kale agreed, because his pride would not let him do anything else. Marek agreed, because he knew his brothers would not listen to reason. And in the human camp, Sarah Chen received a report that the Valkyrie were massing for a final assault. She gathered her remaining soldiers and told them what was coming. Dawn, she said. They are going to throw everything at us at dawn. Her soldiers looked at her with exhausted eyes. They had been fighting for almost 40 hours without sleep. They were running low on ammunition. They were running low on medical supplies. They were running low on everything except the will to keep fighting. One of them asked if the reinforcements were any closer. Sarah shook her head. Still 2 days out, she said. But that does not matter. We hold this valley until we are relieved or until we are dead. Those are the only 2 options. Her soldiers nodded. They checked their weapons one more time. They took their positions and they waited for dawn. Dawn came red and angry over the valley of the Sara 7 prince. Zorath stood at the head of his remaining army. and raised his command staff high above his head. His wound had turned his scales black around the edges, and his eyes burned with fever and stimulants and something that might have been madness. Behind him stood 6,000 Velkari warriors. They were exhausted and demoralized, and many of them had watched their closest friends die over the past 2 days, but they were still Velkarathi, were still warriors of the Dominion, and their princes had ordered them to attack, so they would attack. Zarth brought his staff down in a sharp cutting motion, and the army surged forward. 6,000 warriors charged across the valley floor toward the human positions. They came in waves that stretched from one side of the valley to the other. They came with war cries that shook the air, and weapons that gleamed in the morning light. They came believing that sheer numbers would finally overwhelm the enemy. The humans had been waiting for this moment. They had conserved their heavy weapons throughout the battle. They had saved their best ammunition. They had prepared positions that they had not yet revealed. And now, as the entire Velkari army charged toward them, they unleashed everything they had left concealed. Gun emplacements opened fire from positions that Velkari had never detected. Mortar-launched shells that exploded among the charging warriors and sent bodies tumbling through. The air snipers picked off officers and squad leaders with shots so precise that it seemed like the hand of death itself was reaching down from the sky. And through it all, the human infantry held their lines and poured fire into the advancing enemy. The charge became a slaughter. Velari warriors fell by the hundreds, and those behind them had to climb over the bodies of their fallen comrades to keep moving forward. Some of them made it to within meters of the human positions. A few of them even breached the outer perimeter, but for every human that fell, 3 Velkari died trying to reach them. Prince Kale led a company of his best warriors in a direct assault on the central bunker. He fought with all 4 arms swinging, and his blade cut down 2 human soldiers before a third one shot him through the chest. He staggered but kept fighting. Another shot hit him in the leg. He fell to one knee but kept swinging his blade. A human soldier stepped forward with a rifle that had a blade attached to the end. Kale recognized the weapon from the intelligence reports. The humans called it a bayonet, and it was a weapon that most galactic species had abandoned thousands of years ago as primitive and barbaric. The human was bleeding from a dozen wounds, and one of her arms hung useless at her side. But she stood over the body of a fallen comrade, and she screamed defiance at the Velkari prince, and she did not retreat. Kale raised his blade for a killing strike. The human fired her rifle one more time, and the bullet took him through the eye. He died before his body hit the ground. When his soldiers saw their prince fall, they broke. The charge collapsed as warriors who had never known fear suddenly discovered what it felt like. They ran, they threw down their weapons and ran. They trampled each other in their desperation to escape the killing ground. Prince Zorath watched from a ridge as his army disintegrated around him. He had brought 12,000 of the finest warriors the Dominion had ever produced. Fewer than 3,000 of them were still capable of fighting. The rest were dead or wounded or fleeing in terror, and the humans still held the valley. Zorath was trying to rally his remaining forces when the communications officer approached. "Again, my prince," the officer said, and his voice was barely a whisper. A transmission from the human lines on the main frequency. Zorath turned to the display screen as a human voice filled the command center. "Valerie, command, this is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun of the Terran Reconnaissance Corps. We are prepared to accept your surrender. You have 30 minutes to respond before we begin our counterattack." Zorath stared at the screen in disbelief. Counterattacked? The humans had fewer than 100 soldiers remaining. They were outnumbered 30-1 by the surviving Velkari forces, and they were threatening to counterattack. It was insane. It was impossible. It was exactly what Zorath had learned to expect from humans over the past 48 hours. He opened the channel to his father, the Archon, to report what had happened. The old ruler's face appeared on the screen, and his expression shifted from expectation to confusion to horror as Zorath described the battle before Zorath could finish. His report, the tactical officer interrupted. My prince, we are detecting new signatures entering the system. Zorath felt his heart sink. The reinforcements the humans had mentioned, they had arrived early. No, my prince, the tactical officer said, and his voice cracked with fear. These ships are not responding to the patrol's communications. They are on a completely different trajectory. They appear to be a routine patrol checking on reports of unusual activity in this sector. The words hit Zorath like a physical blow. A routine patrol. The human ships entering the system were not the reinforcements that Chun had been waiting for. They were an entirely separate force, a patrol that just happened to be passing through. And if a routine patrol could field enough ships to make his tactical officer afraid, then what would the actual reinforcements look like? The full scale of his mistake finally became clear to Zorath. 200 humans he had been fighting for 2 days were not a military expedition. They were not a defensive garrison. They were not even a significant force by human standards. They were scouts, reconnaissance soldiers, whose job was to find the enemy and report back. They were expendable. They were the troops that humans sent ahead to locate threats so the real military could deal with them. The real human military was something else entirely. Something that Zorath could not even imagine. Something that made 200 soldiers who could kill 6,000. Valkyrie looked like nothing at all. The Archon's face was still on the screen. His father looked older than Zorath had ever seen him. Tell me, the Archon said quietly. Tell me exactly how many humans you faced. 200, father. 200 humans, and we lost 9,000 warriors trying to defeat them. The Archon was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke the words that would echo through Valkyrie history for generations. Get my sons out of there, now, before the humans decide to stop being merciful. The ceasefire was negotiated within hours. The Archon himself spoke with human commanders and arranged for the safe withdrawal of his surviving sons and what remained of their army. The humans agreed with surprising ease. They did not demand reparations or territory or prisoners. They simply asked the Valkyrie to leave and not come back when the evacuation shuttles lifted off from the Sara 7. Prince Zorath looked down at the valley one last time. The human patrol was marching out of their positions. In perfect formation, 94 soldiers remained from the original 212. They carried their dead on stretchers, and they marched in step, and they were singing. Zorath could not hear the words through the shuttle's hull, but he could see their mouths moving in unison. They had fought for 48 hours without sleep. They had lost more than half their number. They had faced impossible odds and impossible enemies, and they were singing the journey back to the Valkyrie homeworld. Took 3 weeks. Prince Zorath spent most of that time in the medical bay, recovering from his infected womb. Prince Mirek spent most of that time in the ship's archives, reading everything he could find about humanity. What he found transformed his horror into something approaching existential dread. Humanity had only been a spacefaring species for 300 years. In that time, they had fought 47 wars against other species and against themselves. They had never lost a prolonged conflict. Not once. Other species had won battles against them. Other species had won entire campaigns against them. But eventually, inevitably, the humans always came back. They adapted, they learned, they rebuilt, they endured. Their history was filled with stories that made Myrick's scales crawl. A general who had marched his army across frozen mountains in winter because the enemy expected him to wait for spring. Thousands of soldiers had died from cold and hunger, but the survivors had won a battle that changed the course of a war. An evacuation where hundreds of small civilian boats had crossed dangerous waters to rescue an army that was trapped and facing destruction. The boats had come because the soldiers needed them, and that was reason enough. Cities that had been burned to ash rising again within a single generation. A species that had developed weapons capable of destroying their entire world, and had actually used them twice, and then somehow decided to simply keep going. The Galactic Accord had classified files on humanity that Merrick should not have been able to access, but his status as a prince gave him clearances that few others possessed. The classified assessment contained a single recommendation printed in bold letters at the very top: do not engage in extended conflict with humanity. Their most dangerous weapon is not their technology, it is their refusal to accept defeat. 3 months after the Battle of the SAR-7, the three princes stood before their father's court to account for their failure. The assembled nobility filled the great hall, and their scales gleamed in the light of 1,000 torches. They had come expecting executions. A defeat of this magnitude demanded blood. Instead, the Archon did something that no one expected. He promoted all three surviving brothers to his war council. The crowd murmured in confusion and anger, but the Archon raised his hand for silence. "My sons have learned something," he announced, "something that no amount of training could have taught them. They have learned what humanity truly is now. They will help us ensure that we never face them as enemies again." Prince Mirek stepped forward to address the court, had prepared a report on humanity and what it meant for the future of the Dominion. He spoke for over an hour. He described the battle in detail and did not spare himself or his brothers any shame. Described what he had learned about human psychology and human history and human determination. He described how a species that should have been the weakest in the galaxy had become something that even the greatest empires learned to fear. He concluded with a quote from a human philosopher that he had discovered in his research: "It is not the strongest of the species that survives," he said, "nor the most intelligent. It is the one most adaptable to change. The humans are afraid of nothing, not because they are brave, although they are, because they are strong. Although they are afraid of nothing because they have already stared into the void of their own extinction 100 times, and every single time they've refused to blink." The court was silent when he finished. The Volcari Dominion opened diplomatic channels with the Terran Republic the following week. They did not ask for territory or trade agreements or military secrets. They asked for only one thing: an alliance. The humans were confused by this request. 3 months ago, the Valkyrie had attacked one of their patrols without provocation. Now they wanted to be friends, but humanity had not survived 300 years in a hostile galaxy by refusing to make allies. They agreed. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun was promoted to full commander after the battle. She was also assigned as the military liaison to the Valkyrie Imperial Court. When she arrived on the Valkyrie homeworld, she was greeted by Prince Zorath himself. He had recovered from his wound, but he carried a scar on his shoulder that would never fully heal. A reminder, he said, of what happens when arrogance meets determination. Sarah smiled at him without any trace of hostility. The past was the past. The future was what mattered now. Zorath invited her to dine with him and his brothers, and over the meal, he asked her a question that had haunted him since the battle. "How did you stay so calm during those 2 days? You were outnumbered 60 to 1. You knew that reinforcements were days away. You knew that you might die in that valley. How did you face all of that without fear?" Sarah took a sip of the Valkyrie wine and considered the question. "That valley was not even close to my worst deployment," she said. "Should hear about the time my squad got stranded on Kepler-442b. Now that was a rough week." Zorath stared at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time since before the battle, he laughed, not the broken, hysterical laughter of a prince watching his army die. Real laughter. The laughter of someone who had finally found respect for an enemy who had become an ally. The war records of the Valkyrie Dominion were updated after that night. The Battle of the SAR-7 was given an official name that would be taught to every Valkyrie warrior for generations to come. They called it the Humbling, the day that 3 princes and 12,000 warriors learned that some species are not meant to be hunted. And somewhere in human space, Sarah Chun finished her wine and smiled to herself. She had always known that humans were special, not because they were the strongest or the fastest or the smartest, but because when the universe pushed them, they pushed back, and they never ever stopped pushing. That was the human way that had always been the human way, and as the stars turned slowly overhead, humanity continued to spread across the galaxy, not because they conquered every enemy they faced, but because they simply refused to stop trying. The universe was vast and cold and full of dangers, beyond counting, but humanity had faced the dark before, and they had never once forgotten how to find the light.